Hi there, thank you very much for joining the event today. I'm in England, so good evening. Other people, I've seen someone from Virginia, so I'm guessing that's good afternoon. Someone from the Netherlands, also good evening. So anyway, welcome to the On Philosophy lecture series. It's run by a long-running public philosophy journal based in the UK called The Philosopher, of which I am the editor. I'm delighted to say that our new issue is out this week. The theme is What is We? So talking about questions of community, division, selfhood and otherness. So obviously very relevant to these times. On the topic of Stoicism, there's a lovely article from the Spinoza scholar Stephen Nadler about death, contrasting Spinoza's attitude to death and dying with the Stoics like Seneca and Epicurus. So that may be a good motivation for buying it. As for the event tonight, I will shortly introduce John and Donald, who will be engaged in a conversation of about 30 minutes, following which, oh, no video. Okay, so maybe there's a slight problem with the video. I'll just worry about that in a second. But anyway, just to introduce the theme of the evening, obviously we're talking about Stoicism, and this is a philosophy that's had a very interesting renaissance with very popular conventions like Stoicon and other things which have been largely led by John and Donald. In our strange times with the lockdown and other things, if we're not committed to a philosophy of least resistance in the form of a kind of jaded nihilism, then maybe Stoicism would seem like a more attractive alternative. So one of the reasons that Stoicism has become so popular is because the popular dissemination of it has been driven by scholars like John and Donald. So I'll just do a brief introduction to both of them. John Sellars is one of the founder members and currently chair of Modern Stoicism, the group behind Stoic Week and Stoicon. He is reader in philosophy at Royal Holloway, University of London, a visiting research fellow at King's College London, and a member of Wolfson College, Oxford. He also has a new a book out last year, which I will put a link to in the chat function, called Lessons in Stoicism, What Ancient Philosophers Can Teach Us About How to Live. John will be in conversation with Donald J. Robertson, who is a cognitive behavioral therapist and an author. He is also one of the founding members of Modern Stoicism and the author of many articles on philosophy and psychotherapy in professional journals. His latest book, which has had a huge amount of popularity, as evidenced by over 600 reviews on Amazon, is How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. So as I mentioned, Donald and John will be in conversation for about half an hour, following which we will open it up to questions from the audience. So please post your questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat function. I'll be posting a few details to the chat function, but if you go for the Q&A function, and please, if possible, keep them fairly short, that would be very much appreciated. So I hope the initial problems with the video were resolved. Obviously, I can see myself. If you can't see me, then so be it. But hopefully we won't have any problems with John and Donald, who I invite to emerge onto our screens. So I really hope you enjoy the event. Thank you very much for tuning in, and please support the Philosopher, whether through a donation to this event or buying a copy of our super new issue. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Anthony, and hi everybody who's watching. Hi, John. So I thought a good way to begin would just be by, in case there are some people who aren't as familiar with the subject, to ask, who are these guys that we call the Stoics? Who are the main individuals we're talking about, and maybe some of the key texts? So, John, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. And good to see you again, Donald. We were chatting just a couple of days ago. Um, so, yes, so Stoicism is a school of philosophy that started in Greece around 300 BC. So by this point, Plato and Aristotle had both died. And we see a number of new schools of philosophy develop in Athens. So Epicurus is around also around 300 BC, setting up his school. And Zeno, who's the first of the Stoics, starts to teach at the Painted Stoa in Athens. And that's where the school gets its name. And there are a whole series of Greek Stoics that we get, the most famous of which is Chrysippus. Chrysippus is famed for a number of things, really systematizing Stoic philosophy, but also he's a really significant figure as a logician. I mean, he's easily the second most significant logician from antiquity after Aristotle. And we know a fair bit about these early Greek Stoics, but all of their works are basically lost. So when people talk about Stoicism today, particularly people interested in Stoicism as a guide to life today, they're really talking primarily about later Stoics. They're talking about Stoics who were active in the Roman context in the first 2 centuries AD. And the 3 famous ones are Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. All 3 very different characters who wrote very different works. Seneca writes essays and letters. For Epictetus, we've got records of lecture notes. And for Marcus Aurelius, we've got his sort of private notebook where he's jotting down thoughts to himself. And as I say, the focus really is on these 3 later Roman Stoics. Most of the ideas I imagine we're going to talk about tonight are going to draw from their texts, simply because those are the texts that survive. Those are the texts that we can all go and easily read today.
Cool. And I just want to add a little bit to that, to give a shout out or an honorary mention to Cicero, because he's not a Stoic. He says he's a follower of the academic school, but he's one of our main sources for information about the Stoics. And maybe also Cato the Younger, from whom we don't have any writings, but he's an important historical figure in the Stoic tradition. So we might as well jump right in then, John, and say, what did the Stoics, that's who the Stoics were, what did they actually believe? What's their philosophy in a nutshell? Like, how would you sum it up for our viewers?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult. It's such a rich, complicated system. I'm going to pick on 3 ideas, which I think are probably most central. And so the first one is to do with value, right? What's good? What's inherently good? What's most important? And in particular, what is it that we need in order to lead a good, happy life? And the Stoics identify this with what they call virtue, which sounds very kind of grand and mighty. A better way to think of it might be something like having a good character, right? Or to be in a good psychological state, good mental health. So there's a kind of a therapeutic aspect to it, and you know all about this, Donald, from your work in psychotherapy. There's a mental health aspect to this, but there's also an ethical aspect to this. It's about developing good, positive character traits, virtues of justice and courage and moderation. And the Stoics argue in particular that this is the only thing that's inherently good. And the reason why it's the only thing that's inherently good is because it's the only thing that consistently benefits us, right? If you've got a good character, if you're in a good psychological state and you've got these positive ethical traits, you're always going to benefit no matter what situation you find yourself in, whether things are good or bad, no matter how tricky a situation might be. If you've got these good character traits, you're always going to do better than if you didn't have them. All the other sorts of things that we tend to value in everyday life, so money, success, good reputation, what other people think about us and say about us, all those things which are nice to have and that we'd all prefer to have rather than not, all of those things don't consistently always benefit us, right? So you could imagine a situation where someone's being excessively flattered, which might lead them to make a bad judgment and follow a wrong course of action. I mean, people might be saying nice things about them, but that's not always a good thing. Great fame and lots of money doesn't always lead to a good, happy life. We've seen all the stories in the tabloids about celebrities and so on. Those things don't guarantee a good life either. But an excellent character is the one thing that always does. So the Stoics suggest that's the thing that we ought to focus our attention on pursuing, because we'll be the ones that will benefit from that most of all. So that's the first, I think, big central idea. Do you want to add anything to that?
Only, I like the way that you present it. It seems to me that the Stoics, and perhaps maybe this is my bias in part as a therapist, but it seems to me that there are many dichotomies in Stoic philosophy. They love using dichotomies. And one of them, I think, is that they believe what's good for the individual, i.e. benefits them in a kind of therapeutic sense, maybe not exactly the way that we might mean today, but nevertheless a sort of quasi-therapeutic sense, also benefits mankind as a whole. And so there's this moral dimension and a therapeutic dimension, and the Stoics have this radical, controversial claim that they coincide, which is a bold claim, but it's certainly a very attractive one. It's a fascinating thing to claim. And also, when we first started doing this, I remember there were some philosophers and classicists who kind of said, well, you guys are projecting modern psychotherapy concepts into ancient philosophy. But I thought they were completely mistaken about that, because it seems to me this therapeutic metaphor is actually very prominent in classical philosophy. And we know that the Stoics wrote books on therapeutics, and Marcus Aurelius even mentions therapia in book 1 of the Meditations. He says that his tutor, Junius Rusticus, persuaded him that he needed some kind of Stoic therapy or therapia. So I think this is integral to Stoicism for sure. And did you want to say a bit more about what the Stoics have to say about our judgments and the relationship between judgment and emotion, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was going to be the second of my 3 themes, which picks up on what you were just saying about psychotherapy. So again, the Stoics are famous for their attitude towards emotions, and they claim that our emotions are ultimately the product of value judgments that we make about things. And many of the negative emotions that we might experience, anger, jealousy, fear, these sorts of things, these are ultimately the product of mistaken judgments that we're making about things. And if we can see the world aright, if we can reflect on what has value and what doesn't have value, then we can train ourselves to make correct judgments and therefore avoid those negative emotions. So for instance, if someone says something very unpleasant about me and I feel that they've harmed me in some way, then I might judge that they've hurt me, and that might generate an experience, an emotion, of anger, right? But the anger has not been produced by anything that they've done or anything they've said. The anger has been produced by the judgment that I've made. And I've made that judgment because I think that their words have in some sense hurt me. But of course, on the Stoic view, that can't hurt me. It doesn't touch my character. It doesn't touch the excellent state of my soul that I'm trying to cultivate. It doesn't impact on me at all in any way that really matters. And once I can see that, then I won't make the judgment that I've been hurt, and therefore I won't experience that negative emotion of anger. So by thinking of emotions as something produced by our judgments, we also come to the conclusion that in fact emotions are things that we can control. So to compare this with another famous ancient philosopher, someone like Plato, you've got a divided psyche, if you like. You've got reason in one compartment, emotion in another compartment. Emotion is this irrational force. Reason has to in some way control it in some way. And the Stoics reject that model. I mean, they sort of explicitly reject it. And they say, no, our emotions are produced by our rational judgments. And it is something that we can completely control or even avoid altogether.
I'm going to have to exercise the Stoic virtue of moderation in responding to that, John, because this is a therapy question or matter, so I could probably talk all day about it. But I should just throw in the famous quote from Epicurus. In Enchiridion 5, he says it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. And that's what you're alluding to. And that quote is, I think, perhaps the single most famous quotation from the Stoic literature, at least from my point of view anyway, because the founders of cognitive therapy used to teach it to all of their clients and all of their students in therapy. So it became a cliche. And the reason it's so well known, it's not things that upset us, but our opinions, i.e. our cognitions about them, is that it perfectly encapsulates, in layman's terms, what we now call the cognitive theory of emotion, which is the fundamental theoretical premise on which cognitive therapy is based. So that hence why there's a connection between cognitive behavioral therapy and ancient Stoicism. That's the point of intersection between them. So I think the third point that you wanted to talk about is what the Stoics say about nature. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we've talked a bit about ethics and a bit about kind of psychotherapy, but Stoicism as a philosophy is a complete integrated system. They develop a physics and a logic as well as an ethics. And they're thinking about nature as, I think, really important to the kind of Stoic outlook. So the Stoics think that nature is a single integrated whole. We're parts of nature, and nature is something that's continually changing. And the Stoics think, regardless of what we might think about ancient physics and ancient understandings of nature and how we might want to update that in the light of modern science, those two basic ideas, we're parts of nature, nature is a continual process of change, those two things look like they transcend any kind of differences between antiquity and the present day. And so we ought to accept, they suggest, the natural processes and changes that occur within nature. We ought to accept those as just facts of life, things that we can't avoid, things that we can't escape. And this is going to include things like birth, growing up, getting old, getting sick, getting ill, ultimately dying, bereavement, losing things along the way, things decaying, civilizations rising, falling, crumbling. These are all just processes within nature considered as something that's inevitably changing all the time. And if we're not able to simply accept that fact about the way the world is, and the fact that we are going to be swept along by some of those larger processes that are out of our control, then we're setting ourselves up to be constantly frustrated and miserable and upset and disappointed. So we need to kind of accept this fact about nature and just acknowledge that's how the world is. So I think there's a strong strand of realism within Stoic philosophy. We just need to kind of wake up and accept these facts about the world.
So I just want to point out that I think there's something that might surprise our viewers about the way that you describe. There may be several things, but one thing I think that should surprise them about the way that you describe Stoic physics, John, is that you make Stoic natural philosophy sound like a form of psychotherapy in some regards. And I think that's a very interesting perspective. There are a number of respects, I think, in which the Stoics regard their view of nature, their natural philosophy, as having psychotherapeutic value. Would you agree with that? What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, if the Stoics think that philosophy as a whole is a kind of a guide to how to live and how to live well, then they're going to think that all of the different parts of their philosophical system are going to in some way contribute to that goal. And in the case of the ethics, it seems fairly obvious. But the physics also contributes to that, learning how to live well, and the logic too, right? So, I mean, you know, in a typical philosophy class, when you're teaching logic to philosophy students, we tell them, you know, the reason why you want to learn logic is you want to be able to think clearly and rationally and understand what follows from what and how conclusions follow from premises and all this kind of stuff. And that too can contribute to living a good, rational life. So all aspects of philosophy are going to have this very practical consequence.
The Stoics are quite blunt about that. Like sometimes they just say, look, you want to be sane, don't you? I mean, if you want to be sane, then you're going to have to think rationally, and you're going to have to learn a little bit about logic and stuff like that. And also, just to tie a couple of things that you mentioned together, this idea that it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them, then it would be important from the Stoic point of view not to confuse our opinions with external events. And when we're doing science, or when they're doing proto-science or natural philosophy, one aspect of that might be suspending value judgments and learning to describe natural phenomena in an objective manner without emotive language or strong rhetoric or value judgments. So describing an objective representation of events. So that aspect of natural philosophy, I think, is also therapeutic from the Stoic point of view and ties into what we said earlier about our strong value judgments being the things that upset us rather than the things that we're referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, he's writing these notes to himself. We see him do precisely this. We see him describe certain situations in purely physical or naturalistic terms, right? So the fancy meal that he's being presented with is just the corpse of a dead fish. The imperial cloak that gives him such grandeur and status is just a bit of sheep's wool dyed with is it something from an oyster or something? I can't remember.
It's the Murex sea snail.
Yeah.
It's fermented intestines or something like that. It's pretty disgusting stuff.
Absolutely.
Used. Yeah. But there's an irony there. Like, well, I just want to mention it in passing because you brought it up. The Stoic school was founded by a dye merchant, right? And so they have these recurring metaphors about dyeing things. And as you know, Marcus also talks about dyeing his mind purple, or avoiding his mind being dyed purple, dyeing his mind rather with justice, for example. So they also make, from a literary point of view, I guess, this interesting use of these recurring metaphors. So why do you think, John, that Stoicism is suddenly become a thing with the young people or whatever? Why Stoicism become popular all of a sudden?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and it's a really difficult one to answer. I mean, I've thought about this a lot over the last few years, as you and I have done various things and met so many people that have been drawn to Stoicism and found it so interesting. I mean, I think people are looking for some kind of system by which they can live their life. And we've talked a bit about the psychotherapeutic aspect of Stoicism. And again, one comment that people might say is, well, why bother going back to these ancient Greeks and Romans? Why not just use CBT? And the problem with that is that it's maybe incredibly useful to help people fix immediate problems. But that's all it gives you. It doesn't give you anything beyond that. Whereas what Stoicism gives you is an entire ethical framework and a system of values about how you can guide your life, all the time. And why do people need that? Well, maybe it's got something to do with the decline in organized religion in Western societies. Although, again, that depends who you are and where you're from. And we've also encountered lots of people in the modern Stoicism movement who are committed to a range of different faiths, who still are interested in Stoicism. But I think that idea of some kind of ethical framework, that doesn't answer the question why Stoicism, right? Because there are other ethical frameworks out there. So I don't have an excellent answer, a clear-cut answer to that question, I'm afraid. I mean, that's something it might be interesting to hear from people in the Q&A actually, about why they've been drawn to it.
Maybe they'll tell us. I'll tell you what I've heard people saying repeatedly over the years. Right? And this doesn't answer the question either, but it's interesting that these are the things they say. They say, and I'm sure you've heard similar things, they say they got into Stoicism because they saw it as a Western alternative to Buddhism. They saw it as a secular alternative to Christianity. They saw it as a more down-to-earth and practical alternative to academic philosophy. and they saw it as a more philosophical alternative to cognitive behavioral therapy. And psychotherapy has its hands tied in precisely the regard that you just mentioned. One thing that you can't do in psychotherapy sessions is indoctrinate a client into a set of moral values. So you have to be value neutral in a sense as a therapist. But what if it happened to be the case that the client's underlying values were of fundamental importance to their mental health? And learning a specific set of values might be in their interests. So that is perhaps one reason why we need something separate from bigger and deeper than psychotherapy, and maybe why people are turning to Stoicism. Which I guess leads us on to another question that I'd like to get in, which is, what do you think are the main misconceptions about Stoicism? So like everything else that becomes trendy and it's all over the internet, like this will come as a shock to people to hear it as well, I know, but not everything on the internet is true. And there's some like articles and things written about Stoicism that are wrong, like, and misrepresent the philosophy a bit. So what do you think are the mistakes that people make, or the misconceptions?
Yeah, I mean, one very old misconception is this idea that the Stoic is a kind of unfeeling block of stone who's indifferent to everything. So, I mean, I've said a couple of things that people might take in that direction, right? So if your internal character is the only thing that really matters, then you become indifferent to everything else in the external world. And if the goal is to avoid negative emotions, then does that mean that you're just going to become completely emotionless? And so we have to kind of push back against that kind of image of the Stoic. So the first thing to say would be, although the Stoics think that having a good character is the one thing that will guarantee a good life, they're not suggesting that we become completely indifferent to everything in the external world. So we'll genuinely prefer to be healthy rather than sick. We'll generally prefer to be financially well off rather than poor. We'll genuinely prefer that other people will like us and think well of us rather than hate us. Right? Of course we will, right? Who wouldn't? So they're not preaching a complete indifference to those sorts of things. And they're not advocating a completely emotionless life either. So there are certain negative emotions they think we ought to avoid, like anger and jealousy and so on. And the reason why they want to avoid those emotions, as I was saying earlier, is because they think they're based on mistakes, right? I mean, this is worth stressing, right? The Stoics aren't merely psychotherapists. You mentioned Christianity and Buddhism. Stoicism isn't, despite its connections with those sorts of systems, it isn't a faith, it's a philosophy. And it's committed to the idea of getting things right? Seeing the world correctly. So there are some emotions that ought to be avoided because they're based on mistakes. But there are other emotions that are perfectly acceptable because they're not based on making mistakes. And so the idea of being kind of, joyous and happy because life is going well is a good emotion that the Stoics would embrace and welcome as something that is perfectly acceptable, because it's not based on a mistake. So that would be one big misconception I think we'd want to challenge. And I think there's one other as well, perhaps worth mentioning briefly, which is the idea that Stoics would be completely passive individuals in the face of their fate. They'll simply accept whatever happens to them and not try and engage in the world or engage in politics or try and change things for the better. And again, I think we only have to look at the history of the ancient Stoa. You mentioned earlier Cato the Younger, and we could point to a whole series of other committed Stoics in Roman history who were far from passive and were actively engaged in Roman politics, genuinely trying to improve things, standing up for the beliefs and the values that they held. So I think the historical record shows that, as a matter of fact, Stoics were far from passive in those sorts of real world situations.
I would say the Stoics had a reputation for taking a political stand, often, and a reputation for being willing to risk their lives for their moral principles as well. It's quite the opposite of this idea that they would somehow be passive. And also, they talk quite a lot about healthy emotions. They talk about joy, they talk about gratitude, they talk a lot about love and friendship. Marcus Aurelius in particular mentions love a lot. And they also, particularly Epictetus, talks a lot about unpleasant emotions that he thinks are healthy. He's quite interested in the idea that we would have a feeling of aversion towards committing vices, almost a bit like a pang of conscience or something, perhaps. But he talks about healthy shame quite a lot to his students. So there's a range of emotions, a variety of different emotions that the Stoics see a positive role for, I think. I definitely think that that's very important as well. So then, how does Stoicism differ from other schools of ancient philosophy? We have this kind of menu in the ancient world. You could pick and choose. They like to think of it in that way, didn't they? As here's a spread of philosophies, pick one. And they're often distinguished in terms of their definition of the telos, the goal of life, a bit like saying that they had different ideas about the meaning of life in a way. But what marks out Stoicism as being different from, say, Epicureanism or Aristotelianism or other schools of ancient philosophy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess there are a group of ancient philosophical schools that all can trace themselves back to Socrates. And so within that, we would think of Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, and also Cynicism as well, all of which hold this idea that it's developing a virtuous character that's the most important thing. I mean, I think in terms of that group of different schools, we might place the Stoics in between the Aristotelians on one side and the Cynics on the other. And so Aristotle's going to say, yes, you need a good virtuous character, but in order to live a really good life, you need a range of other things as well. You need good social standing, you need a certain amount of money, so you've got the leisure time to do philosophy. And if you don't have those sorts of external things, you're not going to be able to live as good a life as someone who does have them. The Cynics at the other extreme are completely indifferent to external circumstances, and Diogenes famously lives in a barrel, is uninterested in any of those sorts of external things, is just virtue and nothing else. And Stoicism, I think, occupies the middle ground between those two positions as a kind of a sensible compromise, which is to say, as I've said earlier, virtue is the one thing actually that matters. But of course, you would prefer to choose all of those other things like health and wealth and social standing if you can do so without compromising your virtue. So I think they occupy a sensible middle ground between those two alternative positions. As for the Epicureans, I mean, I think that's really interesting. So I should say a brief shameless plug. I've just written a short book about Epicureanism, which will be out in the new year. And the traditional view is that the Stoics and Epicureans are completely different from one another. The Epicureans preach pleasure rather than virtue. And they have an atomistic physics, which contrasts with Stoic organic physics, if you like. So they're often presented as being quite different. I mean, I think they actually have a fair amount in common in many ways. They both have materialist philosophies of nature, which can easily be updated for the present day, I think. They both are broadly indifferent to all of those external bits and pieces that people tend to spend their time chasing after. And they're both interested in a life of psychological tranquility. They're both trying to avoid emotional disturbances, even though they give very different accounts of how you get there. I know, though, Donald, you're much less of a fan of Epicureanism from your psychotherapeutic angle.
I'm more inclined to see some differences, I think, between them. But like, for example, I would say it seems to me that the Epicureans wed or associate the goal more with subjective feelings, which aren't necessarily completely under our direct control. And that might partly explain why Epicureanism, to some extent traditionally, is more associated with withdrawal from marriage, from having children, from society, and so on. At least that's the way the contrast between these two schools is often presented. The Stoa was in the agora, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of life. Epicurus had his school secluded with a close circle of friends, as if he's withdrawing to some extent from things that might upset his equanimity. Whereas the Stoics are more willing to tolerate involuntary, unpleasant feelings. But what matters to them is the nature, I think, of our response. And that distinction would be particularly important in modern, what we call third wave psychotherapy. So that's a hobby horse of mine, right? So maybe I think it'll be time in a moment for the discussion. Maybe we could just have another minute to wrap up by saying something about modern Stoicism, which you've recently taken over from Christopher Gill as the head of our team. And together we were both there from the beginning with the Modern Stoicism organization, which is this non-profit that promotes Stoicism. Would you like to say a bit about what the Modern Stoicism organization is all about and what it does?
Yeah, sure. So we've just had our peak of yearly activities over the last few weeks. So we organise Stoic Week each year, in which we encourage people to live like a Stoic for a week, follow various bits of Stoic life guidance, and we try to measure, so far as possible, the impact of following Stoic life guidance on people's lives. And to date, over a number of years, we've consistently found that people see a drop in their negative emotions and an increase in their sense of life satisfaction after just 7 days of trying to take on board Stoic thoughts into their daily lives, which is really significant. So we've been doing that year on year. You, Donald, have been running a longer month-long course, which has had even better results. And in fact, very recently we got some feedback, a follow-up survey. People that followed Stoic life guidance for a month had this great impact on the quality of their life, and 3 or 4 months later, not only had they not lost that benefit, but the benefit had actually increased, which I think is a really interesting result. We also organise Stoicon, a big annual get-together, which gives people an opportunity to talk about Stoic ideas after they followed Stoic Week. And I mean, I think we're reaching a kind of a watershed. I think we've done that for a while now, and I think perhaps now is the time for us to move on to do some new things. I know that we've been talking about doing some more in-depth psychological studies to get even more data, perhaps with control groups and that kind of stuff. And also to think more about more specialist material. Stoicism in the context of business, in the context of schools. I know you've done a lot of work, Donald, with people in the military. There are a range of more specialist contexts in which we could kind of present Stoic ideas in a way that would meet particular audiences rather than just in a very general sense.
I think that's going to happen. We noticed from the beginning that there were kind of subgroups of people like sports coaches and therapists and people in the military within our conference attendees and so on, and that the group of people that are interested in Stoicism also subdivided into these other groups. So I see that evolving more. And I should mention also, one thing that you mentioned earlier, John, was this confusion between capital S Stoicism, the philosophy, and what we call lowercase Stoicism, the unemotional, stiff upper lip coping style. And this is at the root of one of the most common misconceptions that you find all over the internet. And Tim LeBon, who's our research director, recently published research that was really easy to conduct, actually. It's a simple correlational study that showed that the unemotional coping style that people call Stoicism is not positively correlated with holding Stoic philosophical beliefs. In fact, it has a small negative correlation. So trying to suppress or conceal your emotions is not something that people do who believe in Stoicism. In fact, it's in conflict in some ways with what they do and believe. So I think that will suffice for our little fireside chat about Stoicism. So I'd like to hand over to Anthony, who I think is going to handle the Q&A.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, thank you both for a really great conversation. There's certainly generated a lot of questions, and hopefully we can get through as many of them as possible. So I thought I'd start with a question that starts, I'm a beginner to Stoicism. So this is from Monica Hidalgo, and she writes, I'm very interested in diving more into the judgment/emotion part that you talked about. What do you recommend as next steps to embark on that? So John, would you like to comment on Monica's question about judgment and emotion?
Oh, yes. I mean, there's so much that's been written about this. I mean, I could probably recommend Donald's book, Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, that draws on lots of the materials that we've done in Stoic Week. And that lays out a lot of that material. Our Stoic Week handbook, although it happened a couple of weeks ago, we keep available on our website at modernstoicism.com, so you can access that and see some of the exercises that we use. So I think those might be good places to start.
If you just want to read one of the classical texts as well, a good place to start is with the Enchiridion, the handbook of Epicurus. You could read it like in an hour or two, and it contains that quote that we mentioned earlier. It's not things that upset us, but opinions about them, and a lot of other ideas that are then related to it. So that'd be a good text to read. But yeah, I agree, Stoic Week. And you might also want to look at some books on cognitive therapy or rational emotive behavior therapy and explore how those relate to Stoicism.
Okay, so there's various questions that have linked Stoicism with other thinkers. So one or the other of you may feel happy at addressing these. So one is from Paul Tierney. He asks, are there elements of Stoicism in the work of Samuel Beckett, e.g. Waiting for Godot? So that's one. And then there's one from Nicholas Mayer, who asks, the therapeutic value of Stoicism reminds me of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and Lady Philosophy's, quote, strong medicine for Boethius. Do you consider Boethius to be a Stoic? So I'm not sure if either of you want to make any cross-pollination comments between Samuel Beckett and Boethius in relation to Stoicism.
I might go first just because I feel like I may have less to say. I saw Waiting for Godot 20 odd years ago or something like that, so I don't know if I can remember that much about it now. But Boethius, I think, is probably influenced by the Stoics, and obviously other philosophical traditions, and a number of later philosophers inevitably appear to draw on ideas that originated within the Stoic tradition, or on cognate ideas that possibly go all the way back to Plato and Socrates, but nevertheless are developed in a Stoic-like direction. But maybe John can speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, on Samuel Beckett, I think that's really interesting. And I mean, there's literature written on this. A number of Beckett scholars have picked up resonances between the two. And in fact, I was teaching a course on Stoicism a year or two back, and I showed my students a short play by Samuel Beckett. And when I say short, it's about 60 seconds, which is just someone breathing in and breathing out as the camera pans over a pile of rubbish, right? As just a kind of an image of human life. And there's another great quote from Beckett about giving birth astride a grave. And these, to me, really resonate with ideas we see in Marcus Aurelius, just about the brevity of human life. So I can see why you'd make those connections there. Obviously, there's a kind of a nihilist element in Beckett's thought, it seems to me, which is not quite in tune with what the Stoics are going to say. But it does look like there are some resonances there, I think. I'm not aware of any direct influence. In the case of Boethius, there is definitely a direct and explicit influence. Boethius was a Neoplatonist, a Christian Neoplatonist, but he draws on Stoic ideas, and particularly towards the end of the Constellation of Philosophy, where he talks about fate. He's drawing on Stoic ideas about fate there explicitly. And in Boethius's other more technical works, in logic, he engages with Stoic ideas on logic. So Boethius was well versed in Stoicism.
Okay, super. Now there's another question relating the Stoics to another thinker, and this is Spinoza, who, as I mentioned earlier, Stephen Nadler is addressing the Spinoza versus Stoics approach to death. But this is from Matthew Stein, and he's talking about misinterpretations of Stoicism and asking whether Spinoza misinterprets the Stoics in his Ethics. He comments, "It seems that Spinoza rejects Stoicism because he views the philosophy of Stoicism as preaching total emotional neutrality, whereas both you and, well, the two of you and Seneca talk about the ability to rationally mediate emotional responses." So again, that would be a question of the interrelationship between Spinoza and the Stoics.
Maybe I could say a little bit more about this, but again, I'm going to say I wrote an article about Spinoza which references the Stoics and cognitive therapy, which is you can probably find on the web. Maybe we can dig out the link. But I wrote that article 15 years ago or something like that, so it might be stretching my memory a little bit. But there's a whole psychotherapy in Spinoza that's not as clearly articulated in some ways as it is in the Stoics, but he describes a whole bunch of psychological techniques, actually. And Spinoza's relationship with Stoicism, I think, is odd and complicated. He does, like other thinkers, like Nietzsche, for example, he seems quite critical of the Stoics, but other people have described Spinoza as a sort of neo-Stoic, or more Stoic than the Stoics, I think one scholar even called him. And I went to Spinoza's house last year when I was in Amsterdam, and I rooted around in Spinoza's library, and I noticed that he had copies of Epictetus and Seneca, that were among his most treasured books. So he was certainly somebody who was very thoroughly acquainted with the Stoics. Of course he was. I feel that he maybe draws on them more than he admits. And maybe he misunderstood what they were saying, but was nevertheless influenced by them, perhaps. I wonder what John has to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great paradoxes. Spinoza makes a couple of passing references to the Stoics in the Ethics. They're both critical comments, and yet the philosophy that Spinoza develops is the most Stoic-like philosophy that there is since antiquity. I mean, he had some knowledge of Stoic text, but not much, I don't think. I don't think he was reading that much about Stoicism. But nevertheless, with just a handful of shared sort of opening premises, he develops a philosophy that is so close. And that's just really striking. I mean, you go through I edited a book a few years back on the kind of history of the reception of Stoic ideas. And the one philosopher since antiquity who's most like the Stoics is Spinoza by far. In fact, my undergraduate philosophy dissertation was on Spinoza. And it was through an interest in Spinoza that I first became interested in Stoicism.
Okay, now I'm going to go for another cluster, which I would imagine is a cluster that you guys would be pretty familiar with. So I'll read out a few questions. So this is from Bob Glaberson. Stoicism sounds fairly individualistic. Can you say something more about how this links with other Stoic philosophy? So I didn't get the second half, but it's about individualism. So Shari Haber also says, I'm new to Stoicism, but find it curious to hear the belief that what is good for the individual will is good or beneficial for society as a whole. Would think the notion of we suggests that it should be the reverse. What's good for society will be good or beneficial for the individual. Please comment. And finally, Michael Babbage asks, if you love someone, you put your own happiness in hock to the choices and fortunes of others. Is this a problem for Stoicism? And presumably you could say, by extension, if you love your country or something else, do you also put your own? So I guess there are questions about the frequent accusation that Stoicism is too individualistic and how we mediate between the individual's desire for happiness or contentment and the greater good of society. I don't know which one of you wants to jump in, I guess.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off on that. So, I mean, I said earlier that the Stoics think we're part of nature. Equally, they think we're part of a community. We're born as social animals, and we're born with an instinct to self-preservation. But we very quickly extend that instinct of self-preservation to our immediate family, right? So the mother cares for the well-being of her children as much as she cares for her own well-being. We care for the well-being of our immediate family members. And as we develop and we become more rational, we extend that sense of care beyond our immediate family to our extended family, our wider community. And the Stoics think that ideally, we ought to be able to extend that sense of care to all other human beings, right? And we ought to see no conflict between what's in our individual interest and what's in the interest of the community as a whole. So there are two ways in which we might approach that. One would be to say, well, what's in my interest is to develop that good character that will enable me to live a good, happy life. And that will include developing virtues like justice or fairness, which will mean that I'm a good citizen, if you like, and I'll behave well towards other people, right? So other people will benefit from me as I engage in this project of, if you like, self-development. But equally, because I'm part of community and part of nature as a whole, my well-being is dependent on the well-being of nature as a whole and of that community. So it's in my interest to look after my community and indeed to look after nature as a whole and to be ecological, if you like, because it's a fact that I cannot exist on my own. I cannot exist isolated and cut off from all other people and from the rest of nature. That's just a fact. So my well-being is tied up with the well-being of my community. So I think there is that strong social element in Stoicism also.
Yeah, I'll be a bit glib about it and say if anybody thinks that Stoicism is an extreme individualistic form of philosophy, they should just read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, because on virtually every page of that book, he stresses social virtue, justice, kindness, overcoming anger, cosmopolitan ethics, natural affection. And these are a bunch of terms that the Stoics use to refer to the social dimension of their philosophy, and it's one of the main themes that runs all the way through the Meditations on virtually every page of the book. But it is interesting, people often read that book and don't even notice that it has this very prominent emphasis on social virtue. And one of the reasons that people find this idea confusing is that and this happens also to be an assumption that modern psychotherapy has, over the past 15 years or so, started to radically question. The idea that our individual well-being consists in feeling happy or something like that, like subjective feelings and so on. And this also harks back to one of the reasons I'm not as enamored of Epicureanism as I am of Stoicism. But the Stoics want to say, really, when we talk about therapy and benefiting ourselves and helping ourselves as individuals, they're not talking about feeling good or feeling happy in the trivial kind of modern sense of the word. They're talking about achieving our potential, flourishing as human beings. And that means for them achieving arete or virtue. It means, given that we have reason and self-consciousness and the ability to think and use language, that we would use that consistently, logically, and live consistently in accord with reason. So it's easier to see how cultivating your own capacity for reason so that you live wisely and apply that to your relationships with others might be consistent with the welfare of the wider community and indeed the rest of mankind. Whereas if you were just more of a hedonist, of course your self-interest would inherently, arguably, be more in conflict with the interests of society.
Okay, so my next sort of cluster is related more to questions of consciousness, mind and body. They're not all asking the same thing, but I thought I'd put them together and you can pick out the bits that are most relevant. So this is from Ron Cohen. He asked, what were the various Stoic understanding of the nature of consciousness? Most Buddhists think that it survives death in some form. Most Stoics think that physical death is the end. But what did Stoics think is the origin of consciousness, and how does it relate to the physical body and the external world? Relatedly, and this is specifically for Donald, so maybe he can take the lead on this cluster, Rayan Yilmaz asks, as a cognitive behavioral therapist, do you confront any challenges concerning consciousness in light of current scientific explanations? So I guess that's a question about the relationship between modern scientific views of consciousness and Stoic ones. And finally, Benjamin Hunt asks, do you think that the paradigm shift in Western philosophy to Enlightenment rationalism and the separation made between mind and body stroke world has contributed to any of the anxiety of the moment to which Stoicism now responds? So there's a few different angles, but maybe you could find the link between them.
There's quite a lot to get our teeth into there, I think. The answer to the last question is yes. I do, and I also think that's fundamental to Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius in particular talks a lot about overcoming alienation from nature as a whole and from the rest of mankind, and so this sort of sharp division between oneself and the whole, overcoming that is part of Stoic theology. It's part of their pantheism. In a sense, they want us to broaden our perspective and view ourselves more as being part of a greater whole, and they think that's inherently beneficial for us. And I suppose that relates to the questions about consciousness to some extent. I don't know if this answers those questions directly or not. I'm not entirely sure what the second question was driving at, but I'll have a go and say that one thing the Stoics got right, in my view, is their preoccupation with the scope of our attention, because there's a large body of modern scientific evidence in psychology and psychotherapy that shows that when people are angry or anxious in particular, they tend to narrow the scope of their attention and engage in what we call threat monitoring. So they become very narrowly preoccupied. They get kind of tunnel vision for upsetting aspects of the situation or aspects of somebody else's behavior or character that might be particularly aggravating to them. And a theme that I feel, a psychological theme that runs through Stoicism that I think goes back to their philosophical beliefs about pantheism, is they're always encouraging us to broaden our attention, to think about someone's character as a whole, to engage in this exercise that we call the view from above, and imagine looking down on events from above, to think about expanding our chronological horizons, to think about our life as taking place within a series of lives, something more transient. And we know in modern psychotherapy that training people to reverse this tunnel vision that happens in strong emotions is therapeutic in a number of ways. It increases cognitive flexibility, so it makes us better at problem solving and dealing with complex social problems, for example, but also tends to moderate the intensity of strong emotions. So if I'm anxious and I just focus like a laser beam on the most frightening aspect of a situation, I'm going to make my anxiety much worse, and I'm going to make myself stupider and worse at solving problems. But if I can broaden my perspective both spatially and chronologically and look at the bigger picture, I'm going to be better at solving problems, and my feelings are going to be more complex, nuanced, and less overwhelming. So I hope that answers some aspects of those questions, but like I said, there was a lot to get our teeth into there, and therefore I'll hand over to John for his thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, questions about consciousness are interesting in the context of ancient philosophy. It's not there's no direct equivalent to that kind of concept in the Stoic texts in particular. They talk about about animals being animate and having souls and being alive. And then in the case of human beings, these are entities that have rational souls. But there's not so much of that, not so much of a focus on that kind of first person perspective of consciousness in the way that we tend to use that concept today. So so in that sense, they probably wouldn't have much of an answer to questions about consciousness, because it's not really a concept in which they're primarily concerned with. And maybe that connects back to some of the things we've been saying earlier. So one of the goals is not to have that kind of subjective tunnel vision, to see oneself from a more objective point of view as a part of nature, as part of a network of a much wider set of relationships. And that, in fact, just thinking in terms of consciousness and being inside my own little head perhaps isn't a very healthy starting point in the first place.
Okay, so we pretty much reached the end. There's a good question from Tony Grimwood, which I think will be a nice final one. So he says that I know Donald has an upcoming graphic novel, but what's next for John? So maybe Donald could say a couple of things about his forthcoming graphic novel, and then John could say what's next for him.
I've got a graphic novel that I'm in the middle of doing about the life and philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. I didn't realize until I was in the middle of it, and then it suddenly dawned on me that I'd accidentally written the prequel to Gladiator. It suddenly dawned on me. And also, you know, by visualizing Marcus's life, I realized that some scenes in it, in fact, whole chapters of it, are kind of like a horror story. And I'm not just talking about the Antonine Plague, but like mainly about the plague. So I'm doing that. That won't be out for about another year. And I'm also tomorrow starting work on a biography of Marcus Aurelius, where I'm going to try and talk about his life for Yale University Press for a series called Ancient Lives, but digging more into how his philosophy perhaps may have shaped his some of his decisions as Roman emperor. So that's what I'm busy doing at the moment during lockdown.
Good. Glad you're using your time well, not just procrastinating like the rest of us. John, how about yourself? What does the immediate future hold for you?
Well, right now this year, I'm working on something very obscure and academic, but it does connect to what we've been talking about. So I've been working on a 14th century text written by a Greek-speaking monk from southern Italy, which is about Stoic ethics, and is one of the first modern texts dealing with Stoic ethics, if you classify it as kind of sort of very early Renaissance. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is that he gives an account of the Stoic theory of emotions, which is completely unlike all of the other accounts we know from our ancient sources. But he explicitly says at the beginning, I'm taking this from the books of the Stoics, which raises the possibility, tantalizingly, that he may have had access to texts in medieval Byzantium that have since been lost. So I'm kind of working on this at the moment in a very obscure academic book that will be published in about 200 copies and almost no one will read. But there's some interesting material there, and it may contribute to us sort of, you know, learning a bit more about some of these theories that we've been talking about tonight.
Super. Well, I think we're going to have to draw it to a close there. Sally Morgan's just asked, where is John sitting? And I actually asked him earlier, is it a backdrop of Michelangelo's library?
Yeah, this is the Laurentian Library in Florence. This is one of my holiday snaps from a couple of years ago.
Cool. So yeah, we're actually back tomorrow with an event in collaboration with our partners, Cafe Culture Northeast, and it's going to be, the talk title is Automation and Utopia. It's a talk about the future of work between two ethicists of technology and AI, John Danaher and Brian D. Earp. I put the link to it in the chat section. I've also put a link to both John and Donald's most recent books, which I hope that the discussion tonight will encourage you to buy. And thank you very, very much to both John and Donald. It's been excellent. And obviously we may have a few tools for extending the view from above to Donald Trump if he gets back into power in a few days, rather than we can ask bigger questions about his character and the larger world in which he sits. Perhaps that's a act of generosity from the Stoics towards a very divisive character. I don't know what you think about that, but anyway, thank you so much. And yeah, I will sign off, and hopefully some of you will come back tomorrow for the event with John and Brian. So thanks to you both, and thanks to everyone for attending tonight.
Cool. Thank you, Anthony. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It's been great.